When you buy a cable for your phone or computer, you're supporting a long and complex supply chain that affects people and the environment all over the world. Charging cables begin their life in mines, where metals are dug out of the earth in extremely energy-intensive and environmentally destructive ways. The more cables we buy, the more mining companies need to dig. When Fabian Hühne discovered this, he was inspired to start his company Syllucid to help fix it. Syllucid builds cables that last for as long as possible to avoid needlessly throwing them away. They also use metals that are traceable to ensure that the people and the planet are well protected during the mining process. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hey, Fabian, thanks so much for joining us on the Sustainability Champions podcast. Great to have you on the show.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having us.
Of course. So the way I like to start these conversations is taking a big picture view of what your company does. So as an elevator pitch, what is Syllucid and what does Syllucid do?
Yeah, so Syllucid is an electronics startup, and we are filling the gap for fair and sustainably produced electronic accessories like USB cables. Yeah, it was born out of the realization that electronics can be really harmful for the planet and people, but at the same time they break very easily, which for us doesn't make any sense. And we really wanted to fix both of these things. So that's why we decided to take action and created Syllucid.
Amazing. And so when you say that electronics are really harmful for the planet, can you outline how that is and where that comes from?
Yeah, I think the major problem with is that we don't really know how harmful they actually are. And so electronic supply chains are very complex. They're very global, and a lot of labor problems and environmental problems stay hidden in these supply chains. And it's very easy, to distance yourself from what is happening on mining level, if you want to do that. But what we do know is that there's a huge amount of CO2 emissions that stem from the production of electronics, mostly at the mining stage. There's a lot of environmental destruction, often even in rainforest areas. You have labor rights problems, as well as human rights issues, such as forced labor that can happen, child labor. Especially on the mining level, the working conditions can be pretty gruesome. So you have this mix of, problems for everybody who's involved in making them and the environment.
Gotcha. So it sounds like the real issue is happening, like you said, at the mining level, and that's really when companies are extracting minerals or some sorts of metals in order to actually make the electronics equipment.
Yeah, mining level, I think this is because this is also the most the furthest point in the supply chain. But at each stage of the production, there can be problems. So this can be working conditions even in factories. This is often in China. But yeah, the mining stage is particularly difficult. And this is also where you'd see most of the emissions happening. So mining is a very energy intensive process. And this is why electronics are actually really bad for the climate as well.
Gotcha. Well, that sounds like a kind of a bleak outlook and a bleak picture. And considering that here we are on Zoom recording and on my computer, and I have an iPhone next to me and all my little gizmos and gadgets that I don't even think about, it certainly makes me now think about it. So what is Syllucid doing? I mean, these are, mining is a huge issue from an environmental perspective. It's also a crucial industry because, well, seemingly without it, we can't get the metals that we need to, enjoy life as it currently stands. So how does Syllucid approach this, and how are you solving it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's probably fair to say to begin with, is we haven't really found a way to solve it all. It's not something that we can do overnight. And we certainly can't do it alone. It's really an industry-wide problem. And when we're talking about mining, that just doesn't only concern electronics, but also concerns lots of other sectors as well. So for instance, banking. So there are many different players that have to work together to solve these problems. But what we're starting to do is foremost is we do research on our supply chain and uncover the problems that otherwise would stay hidden, and we try and solve them one after the other. So we're starting with the design of the product, so to make it last longer. I think this is really a core way to solve the problem with emissions. Just if you're using it for twice as long or 3 times as long or 4 times as long, you need a lot less materials. But we're also looking at the current supply chain of the product, and we're working with different partners to source better and more fairly produced materials, and also recycled materials. So there's a number of things that we can already do to make electronics fairer and more sustainable. But that I don't think today you can buy a completely sustainable electronic product. That would be overstating it.
Yeah, that's interesting, and makes you kind of think when the big companies start dropping all of their new latest smartphone or latest whatever's, that it almost sounds like, it reminds me of fast fashion a little bit, in that with fast fashion it's like every 2 weeks in some stores there's a new line that comes out. With mobile phones, every year there's a new line. And it really encourages that throwaway culture for electronics.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And so by making it last longer, I mean, that's a really important thing, because that's kind of, it counters the idea of the throwaway culture, because instead, of having to buy specific cables, for instance, every 6 months or every year, maybe it's every 5 years or so. So how are you doing that, and how are you making the products last longer?
So it's really the design of the product. It's a design choice. There isn't really a reason why they should break after a year, and it's a few simple design fixes that you can use to at least extend the lifespan. So yeah, we're using a bend protector, on extended bend protector on the USB cable, braided nylon to make it more durable, and we're using thicker conductive wires, which are on the inside of the cable, as well as gold-plated connectors. So these are relatively simple things that you can also look out for when you're buying a cable, that will really make it last a lot longer. Not having these things, on the other hand, will make it break prematurely, and that's very sad to see. So yeah, we're really aiming to extend the lifespan of our products for as long as we can.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And from the point of view, there's a couple of other things that you mentioned which are important, because making the product last longer is an important element. But if you're still sourcing poor quality materials, it feels like you're just sort of delaying the issue rather than actually encouraging the industry to change. And that's where you mentioned you're using fair and recycled materials. So what if we start with fair, what does that word mean? Because well, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, fair for us in this particular context means fair trade. So we're working with fair trade to source fair trade gold for the cable. Many people don't know this, but there's actually gold in electronic products just as much as silver and other valuable materials that you're also throwing away if your cable breaks and you're not recycling it. So yeah, we've partnered up with fair trade, and what it means for miners is that they're being paid a premium, so they basically get more money for their work, and they also have strict environmental and safety standards. So it's not as polluting, and it's safer for workers. but yeah, we're also working on other projects where fairness could be defined differently, but this is how we do it for at least one of the materials.
Gotcha. And when you were talking about recycling and throwing away a cable and gold being just tossed into the landfill, so is it possible to, I mean, let's say you have a cable, you're done with it. I mean, obviously, even with your cables, I imagine there is a lifespan, but longer. But let's say I'm using my last iPhone cable. It's fine, and within 6 months it breaks. What's the best thing for me to do with a broken cable?
So if I had to give you advice now, I'd be a little bit torn. The obvious thing to do with a broken cable would be to bring it to a recycling facility near you. You often have them in supermarkets, and just recycle it. With cables, you can actually get a lot of the materials out. With other electronics, the problem is that with electronics, you can only get about 30% of the materials back out that you put in. So it's recycling for electronics is relatively inefficient. And I think we need a little bit more research in that area. Because if you wanted to go down that road, you'd probably want to hold on to it and recycle it once that technology is improved. But at the moment, the best that you can do is hand it in, recycle it locally, so that the materials can be used again.
And then those materials, where do they go? Is that what you're using for your cables, or is it used for all sorts of different things?
It's used for pretty much everything. So with recycling streams, we were not at that point yet where we can recycle an old cable into a new cable. And I think that also relates to the problem that I mentioned earlier with electronic supply chains being really complex, because these metals get molten down and basically then are being redistributed into the industry. The same thing happens when they're coming from mines. So it's very difficult to say that this particular mineral that is in your electronic product actually came from one specific mine or one specific origin. This process of melting things together just makes them more or less untraceable after a certain point.
Yeah, well, that certainly serves or creates a challenge. And so how, on that point, I mean, how do you ensure that your gold is truly fair trade and not, well, greenwashing, basically?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you have to separate it. This is why just sourcing one material that's fair trade is really difficult, because you have to basically trace it from mine to product, and that's quite a challenging process. So in our specific case, we can trace it into the industry. So we can trace it from mine to smelter, where it's actually not smelted with the other gold that's not fair trade, but it's separated. And from there, it's exported to a trader and then back into the industry. So we can see that this process is happening. And we also know exactly how much gold we've bought. So we pay the premium on the gold that ends up being in the industry. So it's a relatively difficult process.
Yeah, and it sounds challenging. And I mean, going through these additional steps of sourcing recycled materials, using fair trade, having a design that lasts a lot longer, I would imagine that this affects the cost of the wire, of the cables and the product. Meaning, if I were to go onto Amazon, let's say, and type in cable, it might be a lot cheaper there because they're not putting nearly as much thought into or the companies there aren't putting as much thought into what goes into it. So what is the cost difference between a standard wire that is not designed to last, does not keep the environment or the people in mind, versus yours, which does all the wonderful things like that?
Well, I mean, so that is a cost for it. So it doesn't, all these things that we're doing that don't certainly don't make it cheaper. Some of the initiatives like recycled materials are actually the costs is in the tracing it and certifying supply chains. So the cost of a recycled copper versus normal copper isn't actually that much higher. A lot of the costs that we have going into making sure that we know where things are coming from, and other research like R&D on how to make cables last as long as possible. So we really had to go and like isolate all the different cases in which USB cables break, and then finding solutions for all of those. So that's a relatively time-consuming process, and I think this is where most of the cost is. So yeah, that's why it comes at a premium.
Gotcha. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, and I think I find that sustainable solutions do require extra time, extra effort, extra paying more, because that's what it means. Even with the fair trade, like you said, it's miners are being paid a premium, or rather, the way I like to look at it is they're paid a premium compared to others, but it's really more like a fair living wage. It allows people to actually have a real lifestyle, rather than being paid pennies per day or whatever the crazy lack of money is, that's standard for the industry. So that has to come from somewhere, and ultimately that cost does come down to the consumer, which I think is okay. I don't really see how else it works, and for people for whom that's important, I think it's there's absolutely nothing wrong with paying even 100% more or 200% more for a cable, because if it's $10 or £10 instead of $2, then you're making a huge impact. Plus, the product's going to last a lot longer. So at the end of the day, I would rather pay once $10 for a cable that lasts 5 years than have to pay every year for 5 years $2. At the end of the day, you end up paying $10, but after all that time, but you're making a bigger impact up front.
Exactly. And I think also in terms of like, if you try and understand what is the actual cost of an electronic product. So one is that if by keeping it longer, you also then don't have to go and buy a new one every year. The other thing is that part of the cost is actually just hidden and outsourced into, not treating people fairly, and not, being very sustainable with the environment. So this is also a cost. And I wonder if it's only the price point, then it's a little bit more expensive. But if you look at it from those perspectives, it does actually make a lot of sense, even from like a cost benefit calculation.
Absolutely. And you were talking about mining earlier, and the environmental challenges associated with that. There's a lot of emissions, and frequently you mentioned that mining is done in tropical rainforests. So in order to do that, there's a lot of cutting down of trees and deforestation, and it's not just the area where the mining is. Typically miners need to build roads, which sometimes extend for miles and miles and miles, and that road, it creates a lot of deforestation as well, and destruction of habitat. So one thing that you do through Syllucid, which I absolutely love, is your tree planting or reforestation initiative through Pure. So can you share a little bit more about that, and why it's so important?
Yeah, so actually, like the tree planting initiative was connected to our thinking on gold mining initially. So like you mentioned, mining, especially in tropical rainforests, does create deforestation. It's not just the roads, but it's also that because gold mining in particular, you use mercury and other toxins. So if you don't do it properly, these toxins can actually like end up destroying entire ecosystems. So you get these toxic puddles where actually a rainforest should be. It's a really tricky problem to solve, because it does have environmental destruction as an outcome, but it has poverty as a root cause. So we wanted to find a way to repair the environmental damage that is caused by gold mining, as well as find a way to invest into fixing the root cause, and to find a way to invest in the local economy at the same time. So that's why we partnered with PER to invest in an agroforestry project in the Peruvian Amazon. So in Peru, we also are sourcing fair trade gold. And in this project in particular, we're planting trees on a coca and coffee plantation. So you can, on the one hand, repair a bit of the damage that's being done, but also do that in a way that supports the local economy. So we're investing 5% of our profits of each cable sale into this project. And we think it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with you. There's some really cool organizations as well where they do sort of I don't remember exactly the term for it, but it's basically like restoration of old mines, because I mean, you were talking about just the damage being done, and it's intense. And so there are some organizations which I think are really cool as well, in addition to that, where they come in and basically in an old abandoned mine that no longer is being used, and restoring that area and everything associated with it, because like you said, there's a lot of toxic chemicals and there's a lot of work to be done to clean up after that. So, but it's wonderful to hear that you're supporting the local communities. That's a really important aspect for ensuring that further deforestation doesn't happen. So, yeah, I think that's really cool to hear, and I love trees. So, it made me happy. What was the moment you realized this was the work that you wanted to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I was, before starting, I was working at a company called Fairphone, which is a very similar thing to us. And I think working there really convinced me that you can actually make electronics in a sustainable way. At the same time, I traveled to mines in Uganda, and I saw what mining really looks like, especially the child labor was very difficult to see. And I thought to myself, what are all these materials really used for? And I was thinking of the 2 euro cables that are being thrown away again and again and again, because essentially people don't have any idea how the electronics are made. And it really convinced me that we need to do something about the way that we produce electronics, but also that I wanted to find a way to convince people to keep the electronics for as long as possible, and also enable that. It was really that trip that did it to me. I think especially USB cables are slightly unloved products that really deserve to be kept longer and handled with more care. So that's what convinced me to do it.
That's amazing. And yeah, it's wonderful that you actually, well, wonderful is an interesting word, but it's wonderful that you saw firsthand what that looked like, because then it completely changes your perspective on it's not just as you say, it's not just a 2 euro cable anymore. It's a whole supply chain. There's people attached to it, and it becomes very real. Well, and what would you say is next for Syllucid, as far as what you're focusing on and what you're looking to do moving forward?
Well, it's kind of two different roads that we're going down. One is that we want to include the supply chains that we've created for our USB cables into other products. Electronics have very similar supply chains. So we can, for instance, produce a charging socket with very similar materials and a similar design philosophy. The other thing is that we're creating more fair supply chains, and we're also looking into more recycled supply chains. So, for instance, we're working on a project with our partner Syllucid on sourcing essentially fair copper into the cable, which at the moment we can't do. So that would be the first time that we have a fair copper supply chain.
Amazing. And I think that especially considering the challenges you stated with the supply chain and how basically all the metals just get melted into one big pile and then redistributed from there. I think it's so important that, you know, we have companies that are demanding fairly sourced metals, because that's how the industry starts to change. And, you know, especially if it's a metal that's particularly difficult, then it has a knock-on effect for other metals, and the industry starts to shift. Plus, if there's a premium for it, you know, everyone wins because people start making more money. So for anyone who's interested in learning more about Syllucid, the work you're doing, the impact you're having, or, you know, check out your cables and buy some materials, where is the best place for people to go?
Well, I mean, the best place would be our website, so syllucid.com, or to follow us on our social media, or sign up for our newsletter, where we send very regular updates on what's happening in our supply chain, new products, and in the industry. So that would be, all of those are really great places to follow us.
Excellent. Well, Fabian, thank you so much for your time and for the work that you're doing, because as we've been saying, there's a lot of environmental and human costs associated with electronics. So it's great to hear that you're taking this challenge and looking for ways to solve it, and to really change the way the industry is working. So thank you for your efforts and for moving the industry in a much more positive direction.
Yeah, thanks for the time.